My name is Carol Brash, and I'm the Director of Asian Studies here at the College of St. Benedict, St. John's University. And I welcome you to hear tonight's speaker, who is this year's Asian Studies Program Scholar in Residence, and also sponsored by the Global Awareness Lecture Series here on campus. So thank you. Thank you for braving the cold to come out and hear Jenny Town, who is a research analyst at the Stimson Center and the managing editor of 38 North, a web journal that provides policy and technical analysis and information on North Korea. If you aren't familiar with it, many of my students should be. She's the former assistant director of the U.S. Korea Institute at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where she focused on North Korea and Northeast Asia regional security. She's she's an expert reviewer for Freedom House's Freedom in the World Index, and she's previously worked on the Human Rights in North Korea project. She's an associate fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute at SAIS, a member of the National Committee on North Korea, and an associate member of the Council of Korean Americans. She also serves on the editorial board for Inkstick, an online foreign policy journal for emerging scholars. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in East Asian Studies and International Relations from Westmar University and a Master of International Affairs from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. And tonight, she is here to help us, as we live in interesting times, consider the question, as the second Trump-Kim summit approaches, what would it take to get U.S. deep park negotiations back on track, and what are the consequences of failure? Oh, and we have a small drama to get us set off. Let me see if I can grab something for that. Please help me in welcoming Jenny Town.
The idea that something goes terribly wrong right as this starts is pretty indicative of how the whole Korea process has been going lately and what it's like to live in Washington, D.C. these days. Thank you to Carol and to St. John's University and College of St. Benedict for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've been telling them I'm originally from Minnesota, so it's somewhat of a homecoming for me. Please go ahead. And of course, the weather is appropriate for such a homecoming to be as cold as possible. So I thank you all for braving the sub-zero weather just to hear about North Korea. I would like to, so I know what these lectures are often like, and I'm going to try and be as non-DC as possible and try and be as conversational as possible to just sort of talk through to a non-expert audience what are we dealing with here, why is this such a big deal, why is it so difficult, and what are the prospects going forward. A little bit of background, since Trump came into power in 2017, this was the year that everything kind of got crazy, as much of everything during this Trump administration. So in 2017, this is the year where the conflict started to heat up. So you had Kim Jong-un that conducted more than 20 ballistic missile tests in 1 year, including 3 ICBM tests, proving for the first time, demonstrating capabilities to be able to deliver a missile to the continental United States. You also had North Korea testing a high-yield nuclear weapon. They claim it's an H-bomb. It's at least an advanced design thermonuclear weapon. So now you have yields that are enormously bigger than what was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki back in World War II. But you also had brinkmanship on a whole new level. So I think those of us who work on North Korea issues, we're used to when North Korea acts tough, when they talk about setting Seoul in a sea of fire, when they have this bellicose rhetoric. We are not used to it coming from the American government, which is oftentimes much more restrained and much taking the high road. And so what we had then was this year of escalating threats and basically an escalating game of chicken of which we did not know where that threshold actually was. And it really did bring us to the brink of war. And I think a lot of us sort of discount the idea that war is even possible, but I think in 2017 we were much closer than what a lot of people like to believe. So luckily, at the end of 2017, North Korea did test an ICBM, the Hwasong-15. It was the second generation of this ICBM, this intercontinental ballistic missile. And at that point decided he had now demonstrated enough capabilities to declare victory on completing his state nuclear force. And because he did that, he then delivered on one half of his Byungjin state policy, this policy of dual development of the economy and of its nuclear deterrent. And then turned around and in January 1st of 2018, in his New Year's speech, opened the door to diplomacy, starting with South Korea. And what we've seen since then is this rapid diplomatic process. And to the point where now it seems very regular for Kim Jong-un to have these high-level summit and high-level engagements with China, South Korea, and now the United States as well. At a time where, prior to that, of course, Kim Jong-un was the ultimate villain and very much isolated from the world. And I can tell you, I spend a lot of time in the region these days, and there is no appetite to go back to that type of tense situation that we had in 2017. And because of that, though, the question is, where are we now in this diplomatic process, and is this actually sustainable? So to talk about this, we're going to talk first about what is the nature of the threat itself. When it comes to North Korea's nuclear program, why do we care? And we do care because of the threat that it posed to the region, to our allies, to South Korea and Japan especially, but also now to the United States directly. So the amount of, and I'll tell you, when we talk about North Korea's nuclear capabilities, a lot of this is really built on estimates. These are not definitive numbers. These are based on what we know of their capabilities and projections. So please take this with a grain of salt. So what we know is that North Korea has the capability to have produced enough nuclear material, enough nuclear fuel to build an arsenal of around somewhere of about 50 to 60 nuclear weapons. And to put that into perspective, a country like Israel has 80 nuclear weapons. Countries like India and Pakistan have about 100, 110 nuclear weapons. So we're talking about a small nuclear armed state that also has now, again, demonstrated more advanced thermonuclear designs. We know that they've historically had short-range, medium-range ballistic missile capabilities that could reach targets in the region, South Korea and Japan, for decades. So South Korea and Japan have lived under this existential threat and are pretty used to it these days. But now they also have demonstrated these longer-range missiles, intermediate-range missiles that can reach targets such as Guam, and now intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach targets on the continental United States. We know that they have an extensive production capability and infrastructure for their nuclear material to produce both weapons-grade plutonium with their 5-megawatt reactor, as well as highly enriched uranium. And the extent of which is actually, we are actually unclear on, because we do believe, for instance, there's one declared uranium enrichment plant at the Yongbyon facility, but we assume that there's at least one more. There might be more. And they also have a large arsenal of chemical and biological weapons, again, the full extent of which is still pretty unclear. But given all of this, I do want to stress that just because they have this does not mean that they are necessarily an imminent threat. But they certainly are a growing threat as their capabilities improve. And of course, there's consequences to this. Well, even if they don't intend to use it, even if we don't intend to start a war, when you have that level of capabilities and you have high tensions, the probability and the propensity for conflict to start, even if on accident, has huge consequences and could very quickly, very easily escalate into a Korean War 2.0 scenario where you have enormous casualties in Korea, in Japan, in the region. as well as, you have four of the largest economies in the world in this region as well. So any kind of disruptions in this region will have global economic disruptions. If it goes nuclear, then you will also have environmental repercussions for decades, as we've seen in Japan's case. So of course, if you're North Korea and you're used to, you know how to deal with brinkmanship, it doesn't necessarily intimidate you. If you're South Korea, the South Koreans were very nervous in 2017, knowing that, again, that they would feel the brunt of any kind of conflict, whether it was intentional or accidental. And so while the US policy of fire and fury and the US policy of maximum pressure did not intimidate North Korea in behaving differently, it certainly did scare South Korea. South Korea, again, like us all, was used to North Korea's bellicose rhetoric. They were not used to America's bellicose rhetoric. And the brinkmanship, and it was unclear, again, where the ceiling was of how high the risk tolerance on both sides went before something bad happened. And even more worrisome is that Seoul saw Donald Trump several times during that process show the political will to and actual fortitude to take unilateral actions against North Korea, catching Seoul off guard on several occasions, and really causing them to worry about what could happen without their consent and what the US might do without regard to the consequences in the region. So the number one priority and the very first priority for the Moon administration, and certainly Moon was a liberal president to begin with and had wanted to initiate engagement with North Korea since he came into presidency. But by the end of 2017, the most urgent need was to reduce tensions and prevent conflict from happening. So when Kim Jong-un in his 2018 January 1st New Year's speech talked about and sort of delivered this olive branch to the South Koreans to say, hey, we're ready to negotiate, Moon Jae-in, President Moon jumped on it. And of course, it started with the Olympics. And so they started their engagement with the Olympics and how to bring the North Koreans in to participate. It had already been past the deadline of what they were, of the qualifying rounds. And Moon Jae-in, President Moon, really did go out of his way to make this a very attractive proposition to the North Koreans. But then, there was all this skepticism of like, will this talk about Olympics lead to anything else? And one thing that it did is that it did create the opportunity for North Korea to say, hey, now that we are in a negotiation process, now that we have, diplomatic relations going on, we are now going to say we're going to stop testing in order to create the right environment, both for the Olympics and for diplomacy. President Moon was very skillful at that point of being able to transition that discussion and that negotiation that was strictly about Olympic participation into a broader peace and security agenda. And that's one thing that President Moon did well in that time period, is really to see the window of opportunity and to really to open the window and run through it. Whereas past presidents had always been reluctant to do anything until North Korea took the first step. So on top of this, then they were very conscious that there was a glass ceiling as to how far the inter-Korean process could go without US cooperation, and especially when it comes to the denuclearization side of the equation. And so President Moon was instrumental in securing a summit meeting between the US and North Korea, the first ever meeting between a sitting US president and a North Korean leader. And then, of course, the South Koreans brought the US on board. The Chinese said we're not going to be left out. Got in early to be able to make sure that their interests were both understood and represented in these separate parallel bilateral processes. If it wasn't through South Korea, it was going to be through North Korea. And so then we had this whole robust, maximum, full court diplomatic press going on. And what it did is in that process, again, this all happened very quickly, and it really normalized the idea of high-level, top-down diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. And it's really quite amazing to see how he was able to rehabilitate his own personal image as well as the country's image from being sort of, again, this caricature of evil and this persona of evil and the ultimate villain within a year to become, by the time he went to Singapore for the US DPRK summit last year, he was a rock star, like a political rock star. And so now this has become a more normal thing. We have these summits going on. Regularly, we have Kim Jong-un popping up in Beijing and on a regular basis, meeting with Moon Jae-in. One of the meetings was within less than 24 hours notice. So this has become much more a normal practice. When it comes to the US, though, the US, I have to say, has little concern about North Korea. It's a small, poor country. They don't have a lot of natural resources. They don't have a lot of economic value. They, of course, are in a very geostrategic position and geopolitical position of power or of influence. But North Korea, in and of itself, is not something that the US government spends much time thinking about. What they do think about, though, is that they often think about the Korean Peninsula in the context of US-China relations and of great power competition. And so because of that, they give little concern about what it is that North Korea wants, what North Korea's strategic positioning is, what North Korea is actually thinking about this, and instead tend to project on it what they think this poor little country in the middle of nowhere should want. And because of this, there is this narrative that we've had 25 years of gains and losses, and as if there's this straight line between the first time we started negotiations in the early 1990s and until now, when North Korea has a full-fledged nuclear weapons program and a robust infrastructure. And so that this whole diplomatic process over the 25 years has failed. And I can tell you, the reality is much different than this narrative. And I think it helps to think of it like a Rubik's Cube. So who's used a Rubik's Cube over the years? Has anyone, who's solved one? One, two? Two people, all right, three. Yeah, so, okay. So the Rubik's Cube, I think, is a really good analogy to what we're talking about today and a way to think about how the US has approached North Korea. A Rubik's Cube is solvable. Not a lot of people can do it. And a lot of people get frustrated along the way, right? The first time you try it, you try really hard, you think you're smart enough, you're twisting, you're turning, and you might be able to solve one side or a couple of sides. Sometimes you can get like 5 sides and still that 6th side is still out of place, and it's really frustrating. So you set it aside for a while and you go about your business, and then like the second time you go, you're like, no, I can get this, right? And you go back and you try again, but you get frustrated more quickly. You set it aside, you come back to it later, you might try again, but every time you try, you put less effort into it. Eventually you're just like, I have better things to do. And then that's the traditional approach. And then there's those of us who don't like to lose, who will say, hey, you know what? I'm so close. I'm like 2 or 3 stickers off. So you start peeling those stickers and putting them where you want them so you can show all of your friends, hey, look, I won. And I think, this is a good way to think about how the US has approached North Korea. So, of course, back in the 1990s, in the first attempt, they negotiated over the course of a year to get the agreed framework. This was at a time when North Korea had a burgeoning nuclear ambition. They had their nuclear material, their fissile material production capabilities were still in early stages. So the goal was to prevent North Korea from going nuclear. And part of that was to start with their, to cap and limit and destroy their ability to produce nuclear fuel. So if you look at the agreed framework from 1994, this is exactly what it did. It dealt with how do we roll back, diminish capacity, cap, how do we prevent North Korea from being able to make the materials in order to make nuclear weapons? And as much as people criticize this as not having worked completely, if you look at the track record of where North Korea was before the negotiations started, where they had an active 5-megawatt reactor, they were building 2 other larger reactors that once they come online, and this was in the late 80s, early 90s, the estimates were they would have the capability to produce enough nuclear material for about 100 nuclear weapons by the year 2000. In that time, when they were doing the negotiations, North Korea had about enough nuclear material to make about 5 nuclear weapons. They basically gave up their plutonium production program. So 2 of the reactors that were under construction were never finished and were in such disrepair by the time that the agreement collapsed that they were never recovered. The 5-megawatt reactor still exists and has been on the bargaining table before, but still, even at running at full capacity, can only produce enough. It produces about 6 kilograms of plutonium per year running in full operations, meaning about 1 bomb's worth per year. So what they had at the beginning is what they had at the end when it collapsed in terms of their plutonium production program. So instead of being able to have, by 2002, when the agreement collapsed, instead of having enough nuclear material, enough weapons-grade plutonium for 100 bombs worth, they still only had enough plutonium for about 6 bombs worth. So, there have been efforts that had some successes. There were, of course, challenges along the way, as there is with any sort of agreement. The question is have we ever had the fortitude to weather these ups and downs of an actual negotiation? And so, since then, we've had certainly plenty. We've had several kind of one-offs, negotiating spats where we might get an agreement, we kind of shoot ourselves in the foot, something else happens, and instead of dealing with those challenges and renegotiating and putting in the hard work, we walk away. One side or the other walks away. It's not always us, but yeah, so it's been back and forth and back and forth. We've tried some things, they worked for a little bit, then they stopped. Then we tried again, worked for a little bit, and they stopped. And by the time we got to the Obama administration, for instance, we were sort of at the end of our patience. We're putting it aside. We're like, I have better things to do. And the better things to do at that time was, of course, everything happening in the Middle East. And as long as North Korea at that time was only testing occasionally, like doing maybe 1 missile test every couple years, or maybe 1 missile test a year, or maybe 1 nuclear test every couple years, it wasn't so urgent for us. And especially, at that time, North Korea did not have an ICBM capability either. And certainly the South Koreans and the Japanese don't see that as an excuse. But in terms of US policy, we had better things to do. And so I think, what you saw during the Obama administration and what you've seen up until this Trump administration is really this traditional twisting and turning, playing by the rules, doing the same thing over and over and over and hoping that eventually you'll get it, but you're just so frustrated you don't have enough patience to do it. What we have now with Trump is he's just pulling stickers like crazy and sticking them where he wants them and like, here, look, it fits. But if you've ever done that, you know that those stickers, once you take them off and put them back on, will eventually fall off, and then you don't know where they're supposed to go. But we are trying something different, and again, it's a different way to think about how we do diplomacy. And what we have right now, though, is that we do have a track record of one side or the other walking away. We do have a record of antagonism. We do have a record of now brinkmanship. And so there's very little trust between the U.S. and North Korea. We did not have a political relationship up until the Trump administration. And because of this, especially within the US, the skepticism that we can ever solve that Rubik's Cube the skepticism is very high. And so what you had is that with each failure, you had more and more people ready to say, I told you so, every time they would go and try. And so you had such political capital in order to pursue this in a meaningful way. You had to bear so much political criticism, you would have to put so much personal capital into this. And for most the politicians, most normal politicians, this was a price too high to pay. Luckily, President Trump is less susceptible to criticism. And what we've done now, like I said, this is not the traditional path. This is not the way the US normally does diplomacy. The normal diplomatic route is that you would do the hard work first on the working level, you would get an agreement, you would start to implement that agreement, and once you've shown progress, then you have a high-level summit. So it's kind of like a reward to highlight how great the relationship has transformed. In 2018, after a year of fire and fury and maximum pressure, when President Moon's envoy came to Washington to report on what happened in the first Inter-Korean summit, then you had again this offer from Kim Jong-un to Donald Trump to say, hey, let's meet. And to everyone's surprise, President Trump said yes. So this made everyone in Washington, in the government, in his administration, very uncomfortable because this is not how we do diplomacy. And part of the reason why we don't do diplomacy this way is, again, if North Korea is considered a rogue actor, you now have normalized his behavior. He now has, equal status to world leaders, and there's less incentive for him to change. That's the rationale. However, in the North Korean case, the traditional approach of working bottom up in a system where the leader has ultimate authority is not a good approach. It is a bang your head against the wall kind of approach. And so there is value in being unconventional. And this is one of the foreign policy areas where this unconventional approach, this step away from tradition, has been actually a very effective model. So what we saw in June of 2018, we had the Singapore summit. Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump met in Singapore at the Sentosa Island, at the hotel in Sentosa Island. And they did establish a new relationship. This was the first time a sitting US president was willing to meet with a North Korean leader. They walked away with the Singapore Declaration, which was highly regarded as underwhelming. However, it was actually pretty important. And pretty important, again, in an unconventional process. One, to establish a leader-to-leader communication channel, direct access to a leader in a system, again, where the leader has ultimate control. But it also set principles for how we're going to move forward and what needs to be included in any agenda in order to achieve success. And so the three broad principles, there was one working action item, of course, but the three broad negotiating principles were to establish a new US-DPRK relationship, to build a sustainable peace regime, and to work towards the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. So notice, of course, that this is to help build a sustainable peace regime and to work towards the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. These are not unilateral actions. This is a framework. And again, the understanding is that in order to achieve success, all of these things have to be addressed in that process. What we've seen since then is a real fixation. So we've had now this unconventional approach. We have this new opportunity. We have a new relationship to have a top-down mandate. We have Kim Jong-un's blessing to say that denuclearization is possible if we can find the right terms and conditions. But we keep coming back with the same old proposition, a new approach, the same old proposition. And the same old proposition is our fixation, the US fixation, on the denuclearization aspect of it. And the proposition is North Korea has to do that first before we're willing to do anything else. And until they do that, all of these other benefits, are off the table. So, obviously, this is a non-starter for the North Koreans, and especially because their program is so advanced already. They're not a conquered country. We can't tell them what to do. This is a negotiation. And what the Singapore Summit Declaration did is it really created the framework for negotiations, the overarching agenda of what needs to be included, but also the top-down political mandate to actually do the work. But it's obviously a very broad agenda. And a lot of what we've seen in the recent months, and there's a lot of criticism that nothing has been done, there's been no progress made, North Korea hasn't done enough. North Korea hasn't been obligated to do anything more than what it's done so far because there is no further agreement on what those next steps are. The reality is a lot of what we've been doing is passing proposals back and forth and still trying to figure out where to start this agenda. And this is a very broad agenda, so you have the US fixated on the third point. You have North Korea that's more interested in points 1 and 2, and if we can't find that agreement on how those pieces fit together, this is why we've seen stalling. And so this is what the narrative that you're seeing moving into a second summit is what now is the US willing to do? And I think it's important to keep in mind that, in this process, there's a lot of criticism that North Korea has not done enough, that they should have done more. If they're committed to denuclearization, why are they continuing their programs and program development? And I'll tell you, in any negotiation with any country, until you have that agreement, that country is continuing to develop their programs as a hedge against failure. But at the same time, the North Korea has taken very specific steps in this diplomatic process. They did return the American detainees. They did stop testing. They have not done any missile or nuclear testing since the Inter-Korean Summit, or since November of 2017. They also destroyed their Punggye-ri nuclear test site. They started to dismantle facilities at their Sohae satellite launching station. And these are things they said they would do as unilateral measures to help build confidence and help to build trust with the United States, help create the right political environment to keep the negotiations going. And they have done the things that they said that they would do. They have not been obligated by any kind of agreement to do more than that. The US, on the other hand, since that summit, had agreed to establish a new US-DPRK relationship and help work to build a sustainable peace regime. But the actions that the US has taken since then, yes, they did agree to halt US ROK joint military exercises while the negotiations were ongoing, but at the same time, then they renewed the travel ban on US citizens traveling to North Korea. They've continued to impose new sanctions and new designations on North Korean entities and individuals. They have continued to champion the maximum pressure policy to keep other countries to ensure sanctions enforcement, strict sanctions enforcement. And then they have also cut off basically all US humanitarian assistance to North Korea in that process. So if you're North Korea coming to the table in this type of negotiating environment, and you know that this was the agenda we agreed to, and you're looking at the track record where where North Korea has said it would do things, it is doing things, the US has said it's going to have a new relationship, but keeps coming back with the old relationship and the old proposition, there's reasons why we haven't gotten very far. So in the second summit, these are things that we need to be looking for, is what is the US willing to do? And is the US really willing to have a different relationship with North Korea? And I think that is a question that continues to come up and will continue, the US will continue to struggle with as we go forward. In the meantime, the US-South Korea relationship has been a bit bumpy as of late. Peace and denuclearization and the normalization of relations, these are dependent processes. These are not mutually exclusive. So while South Korea has really been championing the peace agenda on the Korean Peninsula, there is a glass ceiling as to how far they can go without further progress on the denuclearization agenda, mainly because you also have these punitive measures and the sanctions in place. So a lot of the inter-Korean agenda requires US cooperation. The US is fixated on the denuclearization side of the equation, so if you don't get progress on all of these simultaneously, they will eventually start to clash. With the US and South Korea has, of course, had a greater urgency in this process, wanting, first of all, to ensure that conflict did not happen. But also, Moon Jae-in, a lot of his domestic economic policy is also conditioned on cooperation with North Korea. And so this cooperation cannot happen until there's sanctions relief or sanctions exemptions, and that sanctions relief isn't going to come until there's concrete measures on North Korea on the denuclearization side. So all of these are interconnected. South Korea has been pushing forward very quickly. And because South Korea has been so focused on this issue and keeps pushing on this issue, it's really pulled the US and maintained high-level US attention on this issue as well. So in times when South Korea does not want to have good relations with North Korea, does not want to engage North Korea, the US is less interested in getting involved as well. So certainly, South Korea has been moving forward very quickly. They've had 3 summits, 2 of which came out with declarations with very specific commitments, very forward-leaning commitments. And on the inter-Korean agenda, one of the most important aspects of it from the North Korean perspective is that they want the economic cooperation. And so the problem is now you have a lot of South Korean commitments within that inter-Korean agenda that cannot be delivered until there's movement on the US DPRK side of the equation. Some key challenges to sustainability is the reality is this all came about, it was kind of a perfect storm because of these people. And it is very dependent on this particular cast of characters. And what you do see is that they do have some traits in common. And the first is that they have a very high risk tolerance. All of them have a very high risk tolerance, higher than what leaders have had in the past in this position, in these positions. And the fact that they all have it is quite amazing and a little scary. We don't know how high that risk tolerance actually is. But it does open the door to very big gestures, to very quick decisions, to very decisive moments. But that could be either very positive or either very negative. In 2017, it was very negative. 2018, it was very positive. In 2019, we have to wait and see. They all have a very high resilience to criticism. In some of these countries, you have one-party systems, you have dictatorships. In the United States, President Trump has been very resilient to any kind of criticism of any of his policies. It has not changed his position. He does not shy away from the criticism. And on the North Korea issue, it has been very useful to be able to take moves that presidents in the past have been unwilling to do because they were worried about the backlash, the political backlash that would come with it. They all love the publicity. They're eating it up, especially Kim Jong-un is having a great time, as well as President Trump. And the Singapore summit itself was quite the spectacle. I was actually in Mongolia when it was happening, and Ulaanbaatar was one of the cities that was considered to host it. And I can tell you, when people asked me, could Ulaanbaatar host such a summit? The answer was really if you wanted a very secluded, very remote, very quiet, very, very private summit between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, yes. Mongolia is your place. There was a conference in Mongolia right before the summit, and you saw the Mongolians kind of be like, it was almost us. Like they were like, oh. There was a conference right after the summit on Korea, and every Mongolian that got up started by saying, I'm so glad it wasn't us. The idea that you had 1,500 reporters coming in to cover this, you had such a media spectacle, and the parties were loving it. And it really has changed Kim Jong-un's image overnight. But of course, because of this, you have high risk tolerance, high resilience to criticism. You have a very visible, very public process, but it also means that you have very high risk, high stakes for failure. And this is the part that's hard to predict of what that actually means. And going forward, this is a big problem, is that how do you manage expectations now when you have such a public process where, again, every decision, every move, every meeting is being scrutinized by the media, and you have a lot of media that are scrutinizing because it's Trump involved. You have a lot of media that are skeptical because it's North Korea involved. And you have a lot of people betting on failure, and you see that narrative in the media as well. So every single move is overexposed. And so how do you then actually maneuver within a system under that much scrutiny when you have a highly complex, highly technical negotiation? The other challenge is how do we now get beyond that made-for-TV moment and actually get set up a working mechanism for working level discussions, the actual negotiations? At some point, we have to get down to the details. And this is something that has not happened yet. And again, I think in the months since the Singapore summit until now, what you've seen is a real disagreement on what that working level should be focused on and where do you start that discussion. And this is what we hope to see come out of the second summit, is really this understanding of what are those next steps, where should they focus attention, and how do we actually create benchmarks to measure progress against. So now you have also a real challenge of commitments versus implementation, and this is especially on the South Korean side of the equation, where they have promised things like reopening the Kaesong Industrial Complex, reopening the joint Kumgang tourism project, where they've committed to this joint railroad construction. And so they have concrete commitments on the economic side that they cannot do until they get exemptions or until sanctions are lifted. They have continued discussions going on the military side of stuff, which again, there's only so far that the South Koreans can go without US cooperation and without US buy-in, either through USFK and UN Command. On the US side, so far, the commitments have been very vague. But now, as we move forward, the question is going to be what comes next? And can the US actually implement the things that they promise? And one of the biggest problems to this also is because implementation involves more than the executive branch. And so while the negotiations have been done by the State Department, by Pompeo, by President Trump himself, by Ambassador Began, in order to implement these things, they have budgetary and operational logistics that need to be addressed, that needs the buy-in of Congress. And now you have the Democrats that have control over the House. You have the Republicans still in the Senate. You can have problems in this process if you haven't engaged the Congress in this discussion to buy into whatever it is that we're offering the North Koreans. And the failure to implement creates a huge credibility gap, especially when we're working with high-level engagement. So if you have President Trump promising Kim Jong-un certain things, the North Koreans take that very seriously. So a failure to deliver on those items that have been promised from the president will have huge repercussions on the overall reputation and credibility of the US going forward as an actual reliable negotiating partner. Of course, the Congress isn't the only part of the US government that would have to buy into any kind of agreement, especially once you start talking about sanctions. So how do we coordinate in terms of domestic policy with Treasury, with the interagency process, so that we're not falling over each other like we did during the six-party talks negotiations, where you had an agreement signed one day, US Treasury imposed new sanctions the next day, and everything fell apart. But also coordination among external actors of how do we get the pacing of US, DPRK, and inter-Korea process more aligned? How do we, have a better sense of what's going on in the North Korea-China process? The Chinese are very nervous about what's happening in the North Korea-Russia process and how forward-leaning Russia has been, and how will that affect Chinese positioning in all of this. So there's a lot of actors that are involved in this. And so far, the cooperation and coordination across these actors has been minimal, which has worked to the advantage of Kim Jong-un. And then, the reality is we do have domestic turmoil here in the US, with all of the investigations going into the president, and especially since we are so dependent on this particular cast of actors at this time, it's unclear where if President Trump was impeached, if Vice President Pence took over, that he would carry on this agenda. But you have the same problems in South Korea as well, is that while the inter-Korea process was successful, it's been successful at the cost of the domestic agenda. And so you see public polling in South Korea that shows that the approval ratings for President Moon when it comes to his dealings with North Korea is quite high. It's somewhere around 60%. His approval ratings when it comes to Moon Jae-in's handling of domestic affairs is it's less than 10%. So you do have in South Korea, because you had a successful impeachment process of Park Geun-hye just a couple years ago, you have a highly empowered public. You already have protests going on in Seoul every weekend, massive protests that have already attracted numbers as much as like 60,000 people that are starting to criticize the president for the lack of movement on the domestic agenda. And this is going to eventually, and this does pose problems to the foreign policy agenda as well. And so the big thing too is that right now, these guys are doing this because they want to, but some of them will change. Not all. Some of them will change, and some of those that will change are key actors in this process. And so how can we get far enough along to be able to show the value of this diplomatic process to be able to sustain any political transition? So in the US, the Trump presidency could be 2 years, it could be 6 years. In South Korea, the South Korean president is limited to a one 5-year term. So he has 3 years left. If he can make it that far, if he makes a movement on the domestic agenda and doesn't get impeached. So, there's no guarantees in South Korea of what comes next. There's no guarantees in the US of what comes next if you have an actual party transition, or even if you have the same party, whether or not they will take up this same position on North Korea. So how do we build enough progress now to sustain whatever comes next is a huge question. And one that the North Koreans are also very aware of as they also go through this process. So that's why building a track record of implementation and building trust over these next few years is going to be incredibly important to be able to convince the North Koreans that there is a path here that can outlast this cast of characters. So when it comes to looking to the future, I like to use this metaphor of, we do have a unique opportunity, but it's very high risk and very high stakes, and could get derailed really easily. So I like to waver between the idea that the glass is half full or half empty. I think now I'm back to the idea that it's half full, but that the glass itself is a little bit cracked. So you can still use it. It might be leaking just a little bit, but it could shatter at any moment too. So, a cracked glass, you can maybe put some more water in it. You might be able to fill it full. It might be fine, and you just don't know when it's going to give out. And so, again, I think the end of the question really to be asked going forward is, if I live in Washington, I can tell you the majority of people in Washington are very skeptical. They're betting on failure. And they're betting on failure because, again, they really believe the North Koreans should do everything up front in order to get maybe something from us. And the question is can the US really have a different relationship with North Korea? Or are we always just going to be stuck in this mode of, because we're the big actor and they're the small country, they should do what we want because we want it and we want them to do it. So I'll leave you with that really optimistic thought. And for your information, if you're looking for more information on North Korea, these are some of the better sources, including my site, of course, 38 North. And then we do also offer free curriculum and educational materials at teachingaboutnorthkorea.org for the faculty in the room. So please feel free to pass this on. And I will leave it at that, and I'm happy to take questions.